In 1945, a soldier named Doudou Diallo stepped off a ship in Senegal. He had survived the freezing winters of France, the bullets of German machine guns, and 4 years in a Nazi prison camp. He was promised a hero's welcome. Instead, he was paid a fraction of what white soldiers received, and 3 weeks later, he was dead. Shot not by the enemy, by French soldiers. This is the story of over 2 million African men who fought in the deadliest wars in human history. Wars they didn't start, for countries that weren't their own, and how the world simply forgot them. By 1914, Africa was not Africa. It was a patchwork of European possessions, British, French, German, Belgian, Portuguese. Millions of people, hundreds of languages, ancient kingdoms and cultures, all reduced to lines drawn by men who had never set foot on African soil. When the Great War erupted in Europe, the colonial powers faced a devastating problem. They were running out of soldiers, and so they turned to their colonies. In villages across West Africa, recruitment officers arrived with quotas. Chiefs were ordered to provide men or face punishment. In some regions it was voluntary. In many others it was not. They were promised wages, glory, French citizenship. They were promised that when the war ended, they would return as equals. They were lied to. The Tirailleurs Senegalais, literally Senegalese riflemen, became the backbone of France's colonial army. But they weren't just from Senegal. They came from Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Niger, a force of 200,000 men, fighting for a nation most had never seen. In British territories, the King's African Rifles and the West African Frontier Force mobilized tens of thousands more. In German East Africa, colonial troops fought a guerrilla war that lasted the entire conflict, the only German front that never surrendered. But it was in the trenches of France, where African blood soaked European soil in quantities the history books would later ignore. At the Battle of Verdun 1916, Tirailleurs Senegalais suffered a 70% casualty rate in a single engagement. And then there were the carriers. Over 1 million African men were conscripted not to fight, but to carry ammunition, food, supplies, artillery pieces, through jungles where vehicles could not travel. Hundreds of thousands died from disease, exhaustion, and starvation. In World War I alone, an estimated 100,000 African soldiers and 2 million African carriers would die. Their names were never recorded. When World War II erupted in 1939, the colonial powers reached back into Africa once more. This time they needed even more men. Over 500,000 African soldiers would fight under the French flag alone. In British colonies, more than 600,000 were mobilized. From the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Italy, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Provence, African soldiers were everywhere, and everywhere they were treated as less than human. In Italy, Moroccan Goumiers scaled cliffs that American and British forces had declared impossible. They broke through the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, a victory that opened the road to Rome. In Burma, the 81st and 82nd West African Divisions fought Japanese forces in conditions so brutal that one British officer later wrote, "The African soldier carried us on his back, literally and figuratively. We would have lost Burma without him." And on August 15, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of southern France in Operation Dragoon, the first soldiers to land were African. They liberated Toulon. They liberated Marseille. They freed French soil, while French generals prepared to erase them from history. The African soldier was good enough to die. He was not good enough to be remembered. French colonial policy was explicit. A tirailleur received less than half the pay of a white French soldier. He ate different food, considered inferior. He was forbidden from holding rank over white men, no matter his experience or bravery. But the most calculated insult came in August 1944. As Allied forces prepared to liberate Paris, General Charles de Gaulle gave an order. African soldiers, who had done so much of the bleeding, were to be removed from frontline units. The liberation of Paris would be a white affair. This policy was called Blanchiment, whitewashing. African soldiers were pulled from their units, sent to rear camps and replaced by white soldiers who had often seen less combat. The photographs of liberation, the iconic images of French freedom, would show almost no black faces. When they complained, they were told to be grateful. They had, after all, been given the privilege of dying for France. December 1st, 1944, Thiaroye, Senegal, a transit camp for African soldiers returning from the war. More than 1,600 tirailleurs had been brought here after years of fighting, and for many years in German prisoner-of-war camps. They were owed back pay, pensions, bonuses promised by France. They had contracts, they had papers. When they arrived, French officers told them the exchange rate had changed. Their payment would be cut, in some cases, by 75%. The soldiers protested, peacefully at first. They refused to leave the camp until they received what they were owed. The French army's response was immediate. On December 1st at dawn, French troops opened fire on the camp with machine guns and artillery. Men who had fought for France, many still wearing French uniforms, were gunned down in their barracks. The official French death toll was 35. Independent historians believe the true number was over 300. No French soldier was ever charged. No memorial was built for 60 years. The French government did not officially acknowledge the massacre until 2014, 70 years later. The men buried at Thiaroye died twice, once by bullets and once by silence. Those who survived the war faced a different kind of battle, one they were never meant to win. In 1959, as African nations gained independence, France froze the pensions of African veterans. A French veteran would see his pension increase with inflation. An African veteran would not. By 2010, a Senegalese tirailleur was receiving €300 per year, while his French counterpart received €6,000 for identical service. When families tried to claim back pay or benefits, they found records missing, files destroyed, bureaucracies that demanded documents they knew didn't exist. In 2017, a French court ruled that pension discrimination was unconstitutional. Payments were finally equalized for the handful of veterans still alive. Most had already died in poverty, waiting for a debt that was never paid. In 2024, fewer than 10 Tirailleurs Senegalais from World War II remain alive. Most are over 100 years old. They are the last witnesses. When they die, the living memory dies with them. But memory is a choice, and forgetting is also a choice. Every war photograph you've ever seen tells a story. But look closer. Look at who is missing. 2 million African men served in the world wars. They fought in the snow and the sand, in the jungle and the trenches, in the air and at sea. They were promised equality. They were promised citizenship. They were promised that their sacrifice would be remembered. They were promised everything. They were given nothing. But a forgotten story is not a lost story. It is waiting to be found, to be told, to be honored. These men were soldiers, they were fathers, they were sons, they were heroes, and they deserved better.